Hey guys, welcome to my new mystery.
It was one of those mornings when the brownstone seemed to have settled into a comfortable silence, the kind of silence that makes a man appreciate the precise placement of a chair or the subtle aroma of an orchid. I was nursing my second cup of coffee, black as always, because Wolfe considers cream a culinary weakness, when the doorbell rang with the sort of urgency that suggested a soul in mild panic. Wolfe didn't stir from his chair. He was reading the New York Review of Food and Cuisine, a paper-thin frown cutting across his face like a knife through soft cheese. "Archie," he said without looking up, "see who is violating the sanctity of my vestibule, and don't make a spectacle of yourself." I opened the door to find a young man in a crisp white apron, looking like he had stepped straight out of a culinary magazine, which made sense because he was. He introduced himself as Peter Calhoun, a chef whose reputation preceded him in whispers among the elite dining circles. He was clutching a small crate of red glossy peppers. "I need Mr. Wolfe's help," he said, his voice quivering slightly, though whether from nerves or from the natural heat of the peppers I couldn't tell. "It's delicate, and it concerns my latest menu. There's a sabotage. Someone spiced it with something they shouldn't have." Wolfe finally looked up, one eyebrow arched like the bridge of an ancient aqueduct. "Someone has tampered with your menu. Explain." Succinctly. "I have orchids to nurture." Peter's hands shook as he held out the crate. "It's a pepper. Mr. Wolfe, I discovered it last night after my kitchen staff had prepared a batch for a private tasting. One bite, and it caused extreme reactions. Sweating, nausea, even panic attacks. I fear someone wants to ruin my career, or worse, my reputation." I tried not to laugh, though I'm sure my smirk betrayed me. "So let me get this straight," I said. "Someone slipped super hot peppers into your delicate dishes to make people sweat and what? Faint. Sounds like a crime with a lot of seasoning." Wolfe didn't smile, which is why I love him. Instead, he leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing on the young chef. "You come here because you suspect sabotage, yet you offer no evidence. You demand that I intervene in your culinary dispute without first presenting proof or context. Yet you bring intrigue in a box." He gestured toward the crate. "I assume these peppers are not intended for my lunch." Peter shook his head vigorously. No, I need someone to figure out who did this before it's served at tonight's gala. It could ruin everything." Wolfe returned to his paper, flipping a page as if the matter had been settled. "And what will you pay me for such an investigation?" Peter swallowed hard, producing an envelope. "Generously. Name your fee, and it's yours." I glanced at Wolfe, who didn't glance back. He never does. He merely picked up a pen, clicked it once, and scribbled an amount on the top of his notepad. He slid it across the room toward me, an amount that would make a man rethink investing. "In exotic peppers ever again. Archie," he said, calm as the calm before a hurricane, "pack your hat. We have work to do, and if anyone sweats, let it be from fear, not spice." I tucked the crate under my arm. Outside, the city hummed like a pot ready to boil. Inside the brownstone, the first ripple of a disturbance had already spread. And I knew, even before Wolfe whispered his first deduction, that this wasn't going to be a simple case of culinary mischief. Someone had cooked up trouble, and we were about to taste it, carefully, of course. The brownstone had that familiar scent of polished wood and orchids, but it felt different that morning, like someone had cracked the glass on the serenity. Wolfe, as usual, remained perched in his chair, a fortress of calm and judgment, while I tried to figure out exactly how I was going to manage a crate of volatile peppers without setting the kitchen on fire. Or myself. I had barely set the crate down when the phone rang. Naturally, I didn't answer it. Wolfe never does. He prefers to summon the world to him on his terms through me. Still, there was a distinct note of urgency in the bell, the kind that suggests the caller knows exactly where you are and expects immediate compliance. It turned out to be the first indication that Peter Calhoun's troubles were not limited to the peppers themselves. "I've just had a delivery of unopened packages," Peter said, still clutching his apron like a life preserver. "They were addressed to me, but they're empty. Someone is messing with my ingredients. I don't understand who would do this." His voice trailed off, panic threading the edges of every syllable. Wolfe did that thing he does when he hasn't said anything for a while, a faint vibration in his chair that announces he's thinking far beyond what mere mortals can perceive. "Did you keep the packages?" he asked, voice calm, precise, a scalpel of sound. "Did you note who delivered them? The courier? The time? Any irregularity?" Peter shuffled his feet, looking a little like a man who's been caught trying to hide behind a souffle. I didn't think to ask. I assumed it was the delivery service." "Archie," Wolfe said, eyes sharp as a chef's knife. "Je record every detail. Nothing is trivial. I made my notes with a sense of inevitability. Peter was young, talented, and terrified, which is a dangerous combination when you're dealing with a man like Wolfe. There's nothing quite like watching a brilliant mind map the consequences of fear with surgical precision." The first visitor arrived mid-morning. He announced himself with a polite knock that carried more authority than any polite knock has a right to. Geraldine Kerrigan was a food critic of some repute, and Peter's nightmare had already metastasized to involve her. She walked in like she owned the brownstone, which, as far as we were concerned, she did not. Her heels clicked across the hardwood, a staccato echo of ambition. She gave Wolfe a calculating look, and he returned her gaze like a man sizing a glass of wine for its flaws. "I hear there's been an incident," she said, letting the words dangle like a garnish. "A pepper, perhaps? I would hope your investigation is discreet. My readers have certain expectations." Wolfe made no immediate reply. He let the silence grow, letting her self-importance expand into the room, then collapsed it with the gentlest of verbal taps. "Discretion is the only seasoning in my establishment. Miss Kerrigan, your expectations are irrelevant to the determination of truth." Peter looked like he might faint from the directness of Wolfe's judgment. I, meanwhile, jotted notes like a man possessed. Discretion and truth, those would be key. Before we could process the arrival, another visitor appeared. Lucas Hargrove, a restaurateur with a reputation for aggressive expansion and even more aggressive taste, breezed in. He carried with him an air of entitlement and the faint scent of imported leather and rich tobacco. Hargrove smiled, all teeth, as if he were announcing a victory rather than entering a private residence. "I hear your chef is in some distress," he said to Peter, though his eyes were locked on Wolfe. "Perhaps we can discuss terms. There's always a solution that benefits all parties." Wolfe's fingers tapped a slow rhythm against the armrest. "Mr. Hargrove," he said without emotion, "we are interested only in facts. Negotiations are premature until the source of the problem is identified." Lucas Hargrove's smile didn't falter, but the faintest shadow of irritation crossed his brow. There is always a moment in Wolfe's presence when men like Hargrove realize they are, for the first time in their lives, not in control. Peter tried to explain the effect of the pepper: extreme sweating, nausea, embarrassment for diners. I noticed the little details Wolfe would later use. Peter's hand trembled when he mentioned the reactions, and Geraldine Kerrigan's gaze sharpened as if tasting the potential scandal herself. Hargrove, predictably, seemed more interested in the opportunity than the offense. By mid-afternoon, the brownstone felt less like a home and more like the control room of a particularly precise, high-stakes experiment. Wolfe summoned Saul Panzer by telephone, not because he would leave the room, but because he needed the kind of observations only a man like Saul could provide. Saul, efficient, unflappable, and armed with nerves of steel, promised to look into delivery records, kitchen staff interviews, and anyone who had access to Peter's ingredients. Meanwhile, I shadowed Hargrove and Kerrigan as they wandered through the brownstone, ostensibly polite, but revealing everything they did not intend to. Hargrove's hand brushed against the edge of the counter more than once, as if testing the stability of the environment. Kerrigan's eyes darted to the crate of peppers, lingering, noting, perhaps imagining the consequences of a misstep in public. Every motion, glance, and sigh would eventually become a piece of Wolfe's puzzle. Then came the first disruption. A spice jar, a modest container yet symbolic, was missing from its usual place on the kitchen shelf. Peter noticed it when he reached to prepare a tasting sample. His panic became a near-physical tremor. "It was right there yesterday. Someone moved it." Wolfe's eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked on the empty spot. "Archie," he said, voice smooth as oil, "fetch the jar." I looked at him like he had asked me to fetch a ghost. "It's not here," I said, pointing at the shelf. "Then find it," he said, "and when you do, note where it was. The displacement is as revealing as the crime itself." This is the point in every Wolfe case where the brownstone begins, to feel smaller, more intimate, more observant than the city itself. Every visitor, every twitch of a hand, every flush of the face becomes part of the narrative. We were no longer merely observers. We were participants in a drama meticulously staged by the detective who never moved a muscle except to think. Over the next hour, we identified subtle changes in behavior. Peter's anxiety deepened. Kerrigan's curiosity sharpened into something resembling opportunism. Hargrove's casual air concealed a vigilant assessment, every gesture calculated to appear relaxed while observing the reactions of the others. Even Wolfe, who never left his chair, directed the ebb and flow of tension like a maestro. I shadowed Peter as he double-checked the crates, moved the remaining peppers, and tried to reconstruct the chain of custody. I followed Kerrigan as she pretended to examine a bookshelf while subtly watching Peter's actions. I noted Hargrove's pattern of standing just far enough away from Wolfe to be in control of his own narrative, but close enough to measure the detective's indifference. Each observation added weight to the invisible scales of suspicion that Wolfe would later balance with the precision of a surgeon. Finally, Wolfe spoke, slowly, deliberately, as if tasting each word. "Observe, Archie. The brownstone is not merely a residence, it is a courtroom, a laboratory, and a theatre. The smallest gesture carries testimony. Every human frailty becomes a clue. What you see and record will be essential. You will follow, you will note, and you will report. Inaction at my instruction is part of strategy. Do not mistake it for indifference." I nodded, pretending that his lecture was new to me, though I had heard it often enough to recite it in my sleep. He never moved, yet he occupied every corner of the room, every pause in conversation, every flicker of a candle on the mantel. Evening drew close. The guests departed, leaving a trail of faint perfume, tobacco, and tension. Peter remained behind, exhausted, nervous, and determined. I was left to haul the crate of peppers to a safer corner, while Wolfe reclined with a faint air of triumph. The disturbance had been catalogued, behaviors noted, and the first layer of the puzzle had been laid bare. Somewhere between the chipped teacup and the careful placement of his orchids, Wolfe's mind was already elsewhere, threading the invisible. Connections, aligning the motives and readying the verbal strikes that would eventually unravel the entire situation. And I, as always, was the one to observe, to chase, to endure the hot peppers, both literal and figurative, until Wolfe decided the time had come to expose the culprit. For now, the brownstone was quiet again, deceptively so, with only the faintest hum of anticipation vibrating through the polished floors. Outside, the city continued in oblivious chaos, unaware that a culinary scandal of potentially catastrophic proportions had just passed through its streets, only to be caught, catalogued, and mentally dissected in a single room under the unyielding gaze of a man who never left his chair. And I, with a crate of red peppers and a notebook full of observations, realized that nothing in this case was straightforward, nothing trivial, and nothing without consequence. The brownstone had been disturbed, and the game was officially afoot. The morning after the brownstone had been thoroughly disturbed, it was already clear that Peter Calhoun's culinary crisis wasn't going to resolve itself with a simple apology or an extra dash of seasoning. Wolfe didn't stir from his chair, of course, and I didn't expect him to. He sat like an immovable landmark, surveying the room with the precision of a man who measures everything, every gesture, every glance, every twitch of a muscle, before committing it to memory. Peter was jittery. He hovered near the crate of peppers as if they were ticking time bombs rather than exotic produce. He'd spent the previous night replaying every delivery, every prep session, every interaction in his kitchen, and now he was ready to unload his suspicions. Wolfe listened in silence, stroking his hands together, letting Peter fill the room with details. I noted them carefully. The tasting last night included my sous chef, Martin. He handles all the spice blending. I trust him completely. Or I did. Then there's Lucia, my pastry chef. She wouldn't touch these peppers, but she had access. Then Geraldine Kerrigan. She came by to preview the menu. And Lucas Hargrove, he's got eyes everywhere. My worst nightmare is that someone intentionally contaminated the batch. Wolfe's gaze didn't flicker. Contaminated. You are using the word as if it were chemical warfare. And yet the effect is physiological, temporary, and not fatal. Correct? Peter nodded. Yes, but the effect could ruin me. Make me look incompetent or careless or reckless. Reputation in my world is everything. Wolfe inclined his head. Reputation is a fragile spice. Handle it carefully. And your list of potential offenders. Peter hesitated and I leaned over. Let's hear it. Who had access and who had opportunity? He swallowed. Martin, the sous chef, Lucia, the pastry chef, Geraldine Kerrigan, Lucas Hargrove. And I suppose me, though I wouldn't sabotage my own tasting. Wolfe's fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the armrest. Then we have 5. A manageable circle, Archie. Observe them. Document them. Each one is a potential vector of sabotage. That afternoon I started my rounds. First was Martin, the sous chef, a tall, precise man with a surgical approach to ingredients. His hands were steady, his uniform spotless, and his face an expressionless mask. I asked casually about his movements during the last tasting, watching every flicker of muscle and shift of weight. He spoke with exacting detail, reciting timelines, temperatures, and prep methods. I noted everything, from the way his eyes briefly avoided mine to the slight tension in his shoulders. Wolfe would find it useful. Lucia, the pastry chef, was next. She seemed sweet at first glance, almost fragile, but there was steel beneath the surface. She laughed when I asked if she could have tampered with the peppers. Why would I do that? My expertise is sugar, not spice. Besides, it's Peter's reputation on the line. Why risk my own career? Her laughter was musical, but there was something defensive in the way she angled her body away from me. I pressed lightly. Anyone could slip a jar into a batch. Not that I'm accusing you. Her eyes narrowed just for a moment and then softened. I suppose it could happen, but not from me. Then there was Geraldine Kerrigan, the critic. She was a different breed altogether. A hawk in designer heels, calculating every detail as if the world were a menu she was judging before tasting. I met her at a small cafe near the brownstone under the pretense of casual discussion. She sipped. Her espresso like it contained secrets. You're asking questions about the peppers, she said, eyes glittering. Why? Are you investigating for Mr. Calhoun or for your own curiosity? I grinned, leaning back. A little of both. I like to see the reactions before the main course. Gives me perspective. Her lips pursed. Perspective is important. I only previewed the menu to assess flavors. The peppers, as far as I know, were in perfect condition. But mistakes happen. Or do they? I noted the subtle emphasis on mistakes. It's always in the subtext. She could have an interest, perhaps professional, in seeing someone falter. Or she could be innocently curious. Either way, she belonged firmly in Wolfe's circle of observation. Finally, Lucas Hargrove. Now, Hargrove was a walking storm of confidence, the type of man who measures power in casual smiles and invisible threats. I visited his restaurant, ostensibly as a potential investor in culinary ventures, and observed him in his element. He greeted me warmly but kept his eyes sharp, watching for my reactions, gauging my knowledge. So, he said, swirling a brandy glass, Peter Calhoun has a problem with some peppers, yes? Unfortunate. But I suppose every great chef faces obstacles. Disruption can be instructive. I raised an eyebrow. Instructive or profitable? His grin was perfect, a mask. Perspective, my dear Archie. Perspective. Sometimes chaos benefits the patient observer. The phrase lingered, and I scribbled it down. Wolfe would like that. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had been silent through my report. He didn't ask questions. Not in the usual sense. He simply listened, absorbing every nuance, every hesitation, every inflection. The brownstone itself seemed to acknowledge the tension, as if the house had a pulse in tune with Wolfe's mind. Then the first subtle trespass occurred. I found a spice jar, previously on a shelf near the crate, moved to a different cabinet. Nothing else was missing. No fingerprints, no note, just displacement. I showed it to Wolfe, who examined it with narrowed eyes, his face unreadable. "Archie," he said finally, "someone is testing boundaries. That jar's movement is a message, not an accident. Consider it carefully. Who benefits from such uncertainty?" I thought about it. Martin had precise movements unlikely to misplace a jar. Lucia had been preoccupied with her pastries. Kerrigan had no interest in physical tampering, though she could instigate panic through other means. Hargrove, always calculating, might test the waters indirectly. "Wolfe," I said, "someone's poking the beehive. Do we follow the obvious suspects first?" Wolfe's expression was impenetrable. "Observe, Archie. Document. Wait. The obvious path is often a diversion for the cleverer strategy. You will note the smallest gestures. One of these 5 is orchestrating the disturbance. The method will reveal the motive if we are patient enough." Later, Peter returned with reports from his kitchen. There had been minor anomalies. Extra. Cleaning, unexplained shifts in ingredient stock, a single anonymous note. Handle the heat with care. No names, no threats, just a whisper of mischief. It was subtle, precise, and perfectly calculated to unsettle. Wolfe's fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the armrest. "Every detail," he said, "is a syllable in a language of intent. Archie, you will translate it. The translation must be flawless." I followed Martin to the spice storage, watched. Lucia organize her pastries, trailed Kerrigan on a brief walk to a secondary tasting, and noted Hargrove's careful pacing through his own restaurant. Every movement, every glance, every word, or lack thereof, was an observable pattern. As the day drew to a close, Wolfe finally spoke. "The brownstone has been disturbed, yes, Archie, but not shattered. Observe how the intrusions reveal character, not merely intent. Every person carries a signature, an invisible fingerprint of motives, fears, and desires. Our task is to recognize it before the next act." I sat back, exhausted but exhilarated. The circle of suspects had been drawn. Each one had motive, access, and subtle opportunity. Each one had already revealed cracks, whether they knew it or not. And Wolfe, calm, unreadable, implacable, was preparing to turn these observations into a lattice of deduction. The peppers, it seemed, were just the beginning. The real heat was in human nature, and Wolfe, as always, was the only man capable of tempering it. The next morning I was already out the door before Wolfe had stirred from his chair, leaving him to the orchids and his inscrutable calculations. Peter Calhoun's kitchen was still in a mild state of chaos, and the 5 of us, the chef, his 2 staff, the critic, and the restaurateur, had set the stage for an intricate dance of suspicion. My task was simple in theory: follow, observe, note, and report. In practice, it was a labyrinth of subtle gestures, half-truths, and the occasional misdirection. I began with Martin, the sous chef. He arrived at the kitchen earlier than usual, carrying a clipboard and an expression that seemed to oscillate between concentration and mild irritation. He greeted me with a polite nod, unaware, I think, that I was going to shadow him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Martin's routine was precise, almost painfully so. Every jar was aligned, every spice labeled, every measurement double-checked. I watched as he measured a tiny amount of cayenne, then paused, frowned, and repeated the measurement. Something about that pause struck me. It wasn't hesitation born of incompetence. It was meticulousness taken to an extreme, almost compulsive. I jotted it down. Wolfe would notice the obsessive attention. It could signal guilt or simply the obsession of a craftsman. Either way, there was a story here. Next was Lucia. She arrived with her pastry boxes, humming softly as she moved through the kitchen. Her steps were light, almost ethereal, yet she had a sharp eye for detail. I followed as she prepared her workstation, observing how she arranged her tools, checking the oven temperature, and making quick calculations on a small pad of paper. Then I noticed it, a brief glance toward the spice shelves where the crate of red peppers sat. Nothing more than a flicker, but enough to register on anyone trained to notice subtleties. She didn't touch anything, but she had observed And observation is the first step to influence. From there I went to Geraldine Kerrigan. I caught her leaving a small cafe near the brownstone, notebook in hand, ostensibly noting culinary trends. She spoke quietly with the barista, laughing softly, but every once in a while she'd glance over her shoulder, checking the street, the traffic, the passers-by. I shadowed her at a discreet distance, noticing that she paused occasionally to watch delivery trucks, to note the timing of movements, as if she were memorizing patterns in preparation for something unseen. Then Lucas Hargrove. Now, Hargrove was the type who believes the world bends to his observation alone. I watched him as he moved through his restaurant, greeting staff, inspecting the wine cellar, and lingering at the spice racks as if testing for subtle discrepancies. I noted the slight hesitation in his fingers when he picked up a jar, perhaps checking labels, perhaps just theatrics for an invisible audience. His eyes never left the room for long, constantly measuring, cataloguing, evaluating the reactions of those around him. By mid-afternoon, my notebook was already a small archive of details, gestures, hesitations, glances, and incongruities. Each suspect was a puzzle piece, but the edges were rough, the colors not yet forming a clear picture. Wolfe, of course, would see the emerging image with clarity, and my job was to provide him the raw materials. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, eyes sharp as a scalpel. He took the notebook from me, flipping through the pages with meticulous care. "Patterns are emerging," he said, in a tone that made my notebook feel inadequate. "Archie, note how Martin's obsession with precision contrasts with Hargrove's performative scrutiny. Note how Lucia's observations are fleeting, yet deliberate. Kerrigan is cataloguing indirectly, relying on memory and inference. Each pattern has a rhythm, each rhythm a potential motive. Continue your work." I went back out, determined to dig deeper. I returned to Peter's kitchen, under the pretext of helping with prep. Martin, still methodical, had begun double-checking the inventory of peppers, noting the weight of each jar with an almost ritualistic care. I asked casually about deliveries. "Has anything seemed out of place?" Martin's eyes flicked toward the crate of red peppers. "I don't like surprises," he said, carefully neutral, "especially when precision is required. One misplaced element can ruin the entire balance," I made a note. There it was again, the tension between obsession and opportunity. Could someone like Martin tamper with a batch purely for personal advantage? Possibly, but motive was thin, hidden under layers of professionalism. Lucia, meanwhile, was preparing a new set of desserts. I lingered near the pastry counter, pretending to examine a recipe card. She moved with fluid efficiency, but every so often she glanced toward the spice shelf or the crate, as if ensuring no one had interfered. I caught the faintest sigh, almost imperceptible, that betrayed worry or awareness. I jotted it down. Small gestures often reveal what words cannot. Later, I followed Geraldine Kerrigan to a tasting at a boutique market. She sampled various products, taking meticulous notes, comparing textures, flavors, and aromas. Her eyes never strayed far from the perimeter. She measured not just ingredients, but context, environment, human behavior. It was methodical, thorough, almost surgical. If anyone were capable of subtle interference, it was her. But I needed more. Observation alone was never enough. Hargrove, predictably, remained elusive. I watched him make calls, meet with suppliers, and walk through his restaurant like a man auditing his empire. He smiled, engaged, nodded, but every gesture seemed designed to assert dominance. There was no panic, no oversight, no sign of nervousness. And yet, the way he lingered near the spice storage, checking labels, with deliberate slowness, told me he was aware of the potential for chaos, and possibly comfortable with it. By evening, I returned to Wolfe with a fresh set of observations. He examined them, his gaze unwavering. "Archie," he said, "you are doing well, but remember, observation without synthesis is useless. Each gesture must be interpreted in context, and context is a web, not a series of isolated incidents. Note also what is absent. The empty space is as informative as the cluttered shelf." He handed back the notebook. "Continue, begin to push boundaries, Questions are tools. You may provoke reactions subtly. Responses will provide clarity. I took the instruction literally. I returned to Peter's kitchen the next morning, asking questions with casual curiosity, but calibrated to unsettle. To Martin, I suggested hypothetically that a mislabeled jar might have been replaced with an exotic variant. He stiffened, eyebrows knitting. "I would never allow that," he said firmly, though his hands betrayed a faint tremor. To Lucia, I asked if anyone might have left notes in her workspace. She laughed lightly, dismissing the idea, yet she checked drawers and surfaces meticulously, her gesture that spoke volumes. Even the smallest twitch or glance became a data point in the lattice of suspicion. Kerrigan, when I mentioned hypotheticals of tampered ingredients, leaned back slightly, watching me as if calculating how my narrative might serve her own purposes. Hargrove, on the other hand, remained outwardly unaffected, though his eyes tracked every interaction, cataloguing reactions with subtle precision. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered enough inconsistencies, minor contradictions and human tics to sketch preliminary profiles. Martin's obsession suggested a possible fear-driven action. Lucia's fleeting observations hinted at either guilt by proximity or unconscious involvement. Kerrigan's indirect surveillance suggested strategic interference, likely for influence or advantage. Hargrove's measured control implied he could act without detection, but his motive remained elusive. I returned to Wolfe, reporting each observation in detail, from subtle facial expressions to slight hesitations, from the micro-gestures to the deliberate inactions. Wolfe absorbed every word, his mind connecting the dots faster than I could even record them. "Archie," he said finally, voice calm but authoritative, "the pattern is emerging. Observe the human response to displacement and uncertainty. The pepper is merely a trigger. The true motive lies in how they react, not in the spice itself. Continue. You are close, but not yet within reach of clarity. Pressure, indirect, unobserved, is your ally. Push, provoke, note, but never expose your intent." By evening, I was exhausted, my notebook a chaotic mosaic of human behavior, small betrayals and delicate truths. Yet Wolfe remained serene, as if he had anticipated every detail, every movement, every possible misstep. The legwork had provided the raw material, but the synthesis, the revelation, was still in his chair, still behind his impenetrable eyes, and still entirely under his control. As I left the brownstone that night, crate of red peppers in tow, I realized two things. First, the human mind was far spicier than any chili. Second, Wolfe had already mapped every layer of that heat, every subtle flavor of intention, and every possible reaction. And in the days to come, I would follow, watch, and report, while he orchestrated the slow, precise crescendo that would turn observation into exposure. It was the kind of morning where even the sunlight seemed to pause before entering the brownstone, as if aware that the house was a theater for something more precise than casual movement. I had returned from a morning of legwork, notebook bulging with observations, when I noticed something immediately, a subtle shift in the arrangement of the crates and spice jars in Peter Calhoun's corner of the kitchen. At first glance, everything seemed orderly, but Wolfe, of course, saw the irregularity instantly. I approached his chair with caution, careful not to disturb the aura of judgment that hung over him like a velvet curtain. "Something's off," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Wolfe didn't look up. "Describe, be specific. Start with the crate of peppers." I moved the crate a fraction of an inch to align it with its surroundings, noting a faint scratch along the wood floor. "It was slightly angled," I said, "and there's a small mark here. Could be accidental, but—" He lifted a hand, silencing me. "No conclusions, just facts. Who had access?" I recited the list. Peter, Martin, Lucia, Kerrigan, Hargrove. Wolfe nodded, his expression unreadable. "And timing. Who was last? Here in this corner handling ingredients?" I shrugged. "Not sure. Could have been anyone in the past 12 hours. Wolfe's gaze settled on the crate, sharp and unyielding. "Observe the implications. A minor disruption can serve as a probe. Someone is testing both the environment and our reactions. Note the psychology at work." Before I could reply, Peter appeared, face pale. "It's gone," he said, voice trembling. "One of the special peppers. The one I reserved for tonight's tasting. It was on the shelf, I'm certain of it. Wolfe finally looked up, steepling his fingers. Missing, you say? And you claim certainty of its placement? Peter nodded, wringing his hands. Absolutely. I checked yesterday. I don't understand. It had to be deliberate. I felt a faint thrill, the kind you get when the first tangible disturbance appears. Subtle, yes, but a trespass nonetheless. I made a note. Wolfe's eyes followed mine as I jotted the detail. Archie, he said, voice calm but sharp. This is a small event with large implications. Someone has crossed a boundary. Observe consequences. Track behavior. Begin with those present. Yesterday, I started with Martin. He was measuring spices, humming a little tune to himself, seemingly unbothered. But when I asked casually if he had noticed anything unusual, his eyes flickered. A small micro-expression of surprise that lasted barely a second. I noted it, because in the hands of Wolfe, even the smallest twitch becomes evidence. Lucia arrived, shortly afterward, carrying trays of pastries. I asked about her morning preparations. She moved confidently, almost gracefully, but her eyes lingered, just slightly, near the spot where the pepper had been. She shrugged when I questioned her, smooth as polished marble. I wouldn't touch something that isn't mine, she said. Her tone was casual, but there was a flicker of concern in her glance. Enough to note, enough to question. Later, I found Kerrigan sitting in a quiet cafe, notebook open. She was writing rapidly, pausing occasionally to glance around the street, as if noting more than just her culinary observations. I asked if she had seen anyone enter or leave Peter's kitchen unusually. She tilted her head, eyes sharp, and replied, I don't interfere with kitchens unless invited. But the world is full of subtle movements, isn't it? Disappearance is an art form. I noted the phrasing carefully. The word choice, subtle, deliberate, was suggestive. Not a direct confession, of course, but in Wolfe's hands, even a literary flourish could become a clue. Hargrove, meanwhile, had vanished into his usual afternoon routine, managing staff, inspecting deliveries, and smiling at the cameras of the security system that he was sure watched everything. But even he wasn't beyond small errors. I observed him glance more than once toward Peter's kitchen, each time with the faintest flicker of something that might be interest or calculation. By mid-afternoon, the brownstone itself felt like a living observer. Every door click, every footstep, every drawer opened and closed carried significance. Wolfe sat in his chair, watching, not moving, not speaking, yet orchestrating everything. It's a rare thing to watch someone exert total control through stillness, but Wolfe did it naturally. I made my rounds again, retracing yesterday's movements. Martin seemed almost too careful now, double-checking jars and measuring spoons. Lucia was meticulous in her movements, eyes occasionally darting toward the spice shelf as if verifying that nothing had moved. Kerrigan, predictable in her method, was gathering information indirectly, her notebook filling with observations not just about ingredients, but about human behavior. Hargrove remained outwardly calm, but I caught him watching Peter, measuring reactions and making subtle notes of his own. Then came a small discovery. The missing pepper had been displaced into a different storage cupboard, just slightly, just enough to throw off Peter's mental map. I found it tucked behind larger jars, untouched physically, but subtly hidden. I showed it to Wolfe, expecting some comment, some hint of emotion. Instead, he leaned back, hands steepled. Subtle, he said finally. Deliberate. Not theft for consumption, not sabotage for destruction. This is a message. Observe who benefits, who reacts, and who remains. Indifferent. Therein lies motive. I noted everything, because Wolfe's conclusions always hinged on these small invisible threads. The act itself was minor, but its implications were enormous. Someone was sending a signal, testing reactions, establishing control. And Wolfe, as always, was reading the invisible ink of human behavior with surgical precision. That evening Peter returned, exasperated but trying to maintain composure. I just don't understand, he said. I checked everything this morning. The peppers were gone, and now you say you found them? How could anyone be so careful? Deliberate, Wolfe said quietly. though his voice carried weight across the room. Not random, not careless. Someone is teaching you, Peter, that the rules you understand are not universal. Observe who stands to gain from your disorientation. Peter looked at me for reassurance, and I shrugged, as helpless as any mortal could be in the presence of a master manipulator who never left his chair. The message, subtle as it was, had reached him. It had reached all of us, in fact. The brownstone had become a classroom, and the lesson was in human psychology, in patience, in observation. I returned outside later that night, shadowing the suspects, to note any reactions to the small, almost imperceptible disruption. Martin checked inventory obsessively. Lucia lingered near spice shelves as if verifying nothing had changed. Kerrigan scribbled in her notebook with a strange intensity, and Hargrove moved with controlled calm, each step calculated. I wrote everything down, even the smallest gestures, the shift of an eye, the pause of a finger, the half smile that might be amusement, recognition, or deception. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting. He had taken in my observations silently, turning them over in his mind with the same precision he reserved for his orchids. "Archie," he said finally, "you see now why the subtleties matter. The minor displacement, the hidden pepper, the reactions, these are more informative than any confession, more revealing than a frantic pursuit. Each suspect has revealed a thread of their character. Pull it carefully, and the web of intent will appear." I nodded, realizing that the brownstone's disturbance was far from chaos. Every subtle action, every minor trespass, was a piece of a carefully orchestrated puzzle. Someone had entered our world, moved a jar, hidden a pepper, and we had responded precisely as Wolfe had predicted. Outside, the city hummed in ignorance of the drama inside the brownstone. Inside, every gesture mattered, and I, with my notebook and my shadowing, was beginning to understand the subtle language of intrusion and reaction, the art of trespass that only a mind like Wolfe's could fully interpret. By the end of the day, it was clear. The brownstone had been tested, the suspects had revealed their tendencies, and the first true threads of motive were appearing. The missing pepper, harmless to the taste but significant to the mind, had transformed a minor inconvenience into a lesson in psychology. Wolfe had anticipated every possibility, and I had followed every step, reporting meticulously. As I closed my notebook, Wolfe spoke once more, softly, to no one in particular. "The smallest act can carry the heaviest weight. Observe, record, interpret. The trespass is not merely physical, it is intellectual, and only the prepared mind will discern its meaning." I leaned back in my chair, exhausted, but exhilarated. The game had shifted from subtle observation to the recognition of deliberate disruption. The brownstone, serene as it appeared, was a stage for a meticulous and silent war of human motives, and Wolfe, silent, immovable, omniscient, remained, the undisputed conductor, orchestrating every movement, every glance, every gesture. The morning light entered the brownstone differently that day, slicing across the polished floors in sharp angles, almost as if it had been instructed to spotlight the subtle chaos that had begun to ripple through our carefully ordered world. Wolfe sat in his usual chair, the faint aroma of orchids mingling with the residual scent of last night's cooking, giving the room an almost theatrical stillness. But beneath that calm, I could feel an undercurrent, a tension that was slowly thickening like a brewing storm. I found Peter first in the corner of the kitchen, meticulously measuring out ingredients as if their precise alignment could erase yesterday's disruption. His hands shook slightly, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of concentration. "I checked everything again," he said, not looking up. "Every spice, every jar. Nothing is missing now, but I can't shake the feeling someone is watching." Wolfe's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, like a predator acknowledging the presence of prey. "Observation," he said quietly, "is not paranoia. It is the disciplined anticipation of consequence. Note who notices and who does not. Human behavior reveals itself most clearly under perceived scrutiny." I followed Peter as he rechecked the shelves, noting how his movements had changed. He was cautious, deliberate, almost mechanical. There was a new tension in his step, a subtle hesitation that wasn't there before. And Wolfe was watching, silent, calculating, absorbing every micro-gesture, every twitch, every fleeting glance. Lucia entered soon after, carrying trays of fresh pastries. She moved through the kitchen with the usual grace, but something about her posture was different. She paused by the spice rack longer than necessary, her eyes darting to the spot where the pepper had been displaced. Then she straightened abruptly, almost as if correcting herself. "Everything seems in order," she said lightly, though her voice betrayed an unusual sharpness. "No anomalies." Her tone was casual, but the slight edge suggested vigilance, the kind born from awareness of unseen scrutiny. I made a mental note. Wolfe would have appreciated it. Every movement, every word, every hesitation mattered more than a direct admission. By midday, I had circled the suspects once more. Martin, for his part, had taken to rechecking every spice jar 3 times in succession, each movement precise, yet increasingly nervous. Kerrigan had returned to her notebook, but now she scribbled not just observations about ingredients, but about human behavior, who paused at what shelf, whose eyes lingered where, and the briefest reactions to perceived disturbance. Hargrove, meanwhile, appeared outwardly calm, but there was a subtle calculation in his every gesture. The slightest shift of weight, the barely perceptible glance toward Peter's workstation, the faintest pause as if he were measuring reactions, before committing any movement. Then came the first real escalation. I was retracing my earlier route through the brownstone when I noticed the lock on the pantry door slightly ajar. My pulse quickened. Locks, after all, were meant to delineate boundaries. Opening it, I saw that someone had rifled through the provisions. Nothing had been taken, or at least nothing obvious, but the subtle signs of disturbance were unmistakable. Jars nudged, packets shifted, crumbs where none had been before. I reported immediately to Wolfe. He lifted his eyes from the orchid's expression, calm but deadly precise. "Observe the intrusion," he said. "This is no longer a simple test. The perpetrator has moved beyond subtlety into action, but even action carries intelligence. Note the manner of the disturbance, and note who benefits from the confusion it sows." I started a new series of observations. Peter naturally reacted first, moving to reorganize the pantry, muttering under his breath. Martin froze, as if calculating whether he should interfere or remain detached. Lucia paused mid-step, watching Peter, then resumed her work. But I caught the briefest flicker of recognition in her eyes, the way one acknowledges a puzzle piece in the wrong place. Kerrigan, notebook in hand, observed silently, almost with fascination. Hargrove continued outwardly calm, though his subtle adjustments in posture suggested he too had noticed. The pattern became evident quickly. The intruder was deliberate, skilled and aware of the psychological ripple effects their actions could generate. Whoever it was, they understood more than just the physical layout. They were probing human reactions, testing thresholds, measuring responses. By late afternoon, Wolfe had called Saul Panzer. Saul arrived promptly, bringing the kind of quiet, competence that made him invaluable. We coordinated a series of careful observations, covering areas that Peter, Martin, and the others routinely frequented. Saul moved through the brownstone like a shadow, noting footprints, scuff marks, the barely visible traces of manipulation that only a trained eye could detect. We discovered more subtle disturbances, the positioning of utensils slightly off-kilter, faint smudges on counter edges, a single notebook page turned inexplicably. It was as though someone was communicating through small, deliberate acts, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for the observant, the careful, the disciplined mind. Wolfe remained immobile, watching. "Do you see, Archie?" he asked. "Observe how the smallest disruptions provoke the greatest awareness. The intruder seeks control, through minor manipulation, through psychological subtext, rather than outright confrontation. And those who respond hastily, those who react without analysis, reveal themselves." Peter was next to demonstrate that principle. In his agitation over the pantry, he moved with impulsiveness, replacing jars incorrectly, knocking over a container of salt in his haste. Martin hesitated, caught between intervention and observation. Lucia maintained control, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her careful calculation. Kerrigan continued to record, fascinated by the interplay of human reactions. Hargrove, still outwardly calm, had begun subtle adjustments in positioning, almost imperceptible shifts intended to influence or observe outcomes. By the evening, the brownstone was a charged arena of behavior, observation, and reaction. Wolfe directed Saul and me to focus on subtle lines of sight, paths of least disturbance, and the natural behavioral inclinations of each individual. Every gesture, every glance, every pause could be significant. Then came the breakthrough. While examining the pantry yet again, I noticed a small, almost invisible thread of fabric caught on a corner of a jar, a fiber that did not belong to any clothing worn within the brownstone. I carefully lifted it and traced its origin, a tiny smear of soot on the floor, suggesting recent passage through the fireplace area. Someone had moved deliberately through the brownstone's spaces, leaving traces designed to test our perception. Showed the finding to Wolfe. He studied it, expression unreadable. "A calculated intrusion," he said. "Small, controlled, intelligent. Note the trajectory, the points of contact, the timing. The intruder knows our routines. This is no longer random. This is purposeful." We began mapping movement patterns, cross-referencing them with each individual's known habits. Slowly, a picture emerged. Someone inside the brownstone, or at least with intimate knowledge of its layout, was manipulating the environment to provoke observation, to test reactions, to establish dominance without overt confrontation. The key: evening progressed into night. I documented every detail, every subtle sign of human response, while Saul reinforced observational positions, and Wolfe analyzed the data with his characteristic precision. The intruder had escalated from minor trespass to deliberate psychological testing, and the patterns suggested more action was imminent. By the time I finally paused, exhaustion settling into my bones, Wolfe spoke once more, quietly, yet with weight. "Observe, record, interpret. The intruder's actions are a dialogue, not an assault, and in the dialogue one always reveals more than intended. Note who reveals themselves. That is your advantage." Outside, the city continued in its oblivious hum. Inside, the brownstone had become a crucible of observation, tension, and deliberate movement. Each small disruption, each calculated gesture, each subtle test of reaction had transformed ordinary space into a stage for intellect and subtlety. And Wolfe, in his calm, unyielding manner, remained the conductor, orchestrating an invisible symphony of behavior, response, and revelation. The night outside the brownstone was quiet, a deceptive calm that only heightened the sense of tension within. Inside, the air felt heavier, charged with the silent calculation of every movement, every glance, every subtle shift. Wolfe remained in his chair, his eyes half-lidded yet piercing, absorbing the faintest cues, while Saul moved like a shadow. Through the hallways, noting every anomaly with a precision born of long experience, I made my rounds again, retracing each step the intruder could have taken, checking the pantry, the spice racks, the corners of the kitchen that bore the slightest traces of disturbance. Each detail seemed minor at first glance, yet Wolfe had trained me to see the significance hidden in minutiae. A misplaced teaspoon, a faint footprint in the dust, a jar that was slightly ajar. These were not random occurrences. They were calculated. Acts intended to provoke, to observe, to manipulate. Peter's agitation had grown throughout the evening. He hovered near the pantry, touching and retouching, repositioning jars with obsessive care. His face, normally calm when in the kitchen, now reflected strain, the faint sheen of perspiration across his brow. I could see the internal struggle. He wanted to act, to confront, but the invisible tension Wolfe had cultivated restrained him. Every impulse was being tested, measured, weighed against the unknown observer's intentions. Lucia, on the other hand, maintained outward composure, yet there was a subtle rigidity in her posture. She moved through the brownstone with grace, placing trays of food or adjusting utensils, all the while casting quick, calculating glances at the others. She was watching, yes, but also gauging reactions, interpreting pauses, measuring hesitation. Her skill lay in her subtlety. She was aware, adaptive, and quiet in her control. By the second hour of night, Wolfe had summoned us to the central room. The orchid's faint fragrance mixed with the lingering scent of the day's cooking, giving the space an almost theatrical serenity. Wolfe's gaze moved slowly across the room, resting on each person for just a moment longer than polite, a flicker of recognition in his eyes that conveyed more than any words could. "The intruder," he said softly, "has escalated. The previous disturbances were reconnaissance. Tonight they seek interaction, response. We must anticipate without revealing our own hand." Saul moved to reinforce observation points near the pantry and the adjoining hallways. He carried a quiet competence, his presence almost invisible, yet his eyes were alert, tracking subtle shifts in shadow and sound. Kerrigan, notebook in hand, followed discreetly, recording everything. The movements, the gestures, the reactions, the unspoken dialogue of the space. Hargrove, outwardly calm, seemed to blend into the background, yet his posture and glances suggested an acute awareness of the environment, a readiness to act if required. The first deliberate action came as a whisper of sound, a slight scraping from the hallway adjoining the study. It was faint, barely perceptible, but Wolfe's eyes flicked toward it, a small twitch in his hand suggesting immediate calculation. "Observe," he said quietly. "He, or she, tests the periphery first, the edges, where control is weakest." Moved closer to the sound, careful not to reveal my own presence. The door to the study, which had been locked earlier in the evening, was now slightly ajar. A shadow shifted behind it, fleeting, almost imperceptible. My pulse quickened, but I reminded myself to maintain discipline. One false move, one reactive gesture, could alert the intruder to our awareness. Peter, sensing my movement, stiffened beside me. His hand hovered near the pantry door, ready to intervene, yet restrained by the unspoken command of observation. "It's too quiet," he muttered under his breath. "I should—" But he stopped, catching the meaning in Wolfe's silent instruction. Then came a deliberate disturbance, a soft thud from the direction of the library, followed almost immediately by the faint smell of smoke. Someone had moved through the fireplace, and a thin wisp of soot lingered in the air. My mind raced through possibilities. The intruder was bold, precise, and aware of the psychological effects of each action. They were testing us, probing the limits of attention and composure. Lucia reacted first, moving with controlled precision toward the source. She did not speak, yet her body language conveyed readiness, awareness, and a careful calculation of potential outcomes. Hargrove too shifted, almost imperceptibly, positioning himself near the rear of the hall as if anticipating a retreat or a confrontation. Martin, caught between observation and action, froze, his internal conflict mirrored in the slight tremor of his hands. Wolfe remained immobile, his expression calm, yet I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "Note how each individual reacts," he said quietly. "The intruder exploits natural tendencies, the instinct to protect, to confront, to intervene. Those who restrain themselves, who observe without immediate action, hold advantage. The others reveal vulnerabilities. We advance slowly, in careful coordination. Saul led, shadowed by my presence, with Kerrigan noting every micro-movement, every reaction. The library door was slightly cracked, a sliver of shadow shifting within. The faint scent of soot lingered, and there, on the edge of the rug, was a small deliberate smear of powder, chalk, not dust, trailing toward the fireplace. It was a breadcrumb, a test of our attention, a silent message. As we approached, the intruder revealed themselves, not with aggression, but with a deliberate presence that demanded recognition. A figure stepped from behind the fireplace, hands raised slightly, posture controlled, calm. "You've noticed me," the voice said, soft, deliberate, tinged with amusement. "Very good." Wolfe's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Observation is not merely noticing. It is understanding, and understanding requires discernment of motive. The intruder's eyes flicked over each of us, pausing on Peter's nervous gestures, Lucia's calculated composure, Martin's hesitant stance, Hargrove's subtle adjustments, and Kerrigan's notebook. There was acknowledgement, yes, but also a challenge, a testing of the limits of awareness. I sought subtlety first, the intruder continued. Minor disturbances, small manipulations, to see who notices, who reacts, who interprets. But your persistence leaves me little choice but direct engagement. Peter stiffened, ready to speak, but a glance from Wolfe silenced him. There would be no hasty action tonight. Observation remained paramount. The intruder moved closer, deliberately, with no sudden gestures. Each step was measured, controlled, a demonstration of both awareness and restraint. Your routines, your movements, your interactions, the intruder said, all reveal more than you know. The tests were to measure these and to ensure the proper challenge is presented. Wolfe finally spoke, his tone calm yet unyielding. Your challenge is understood, but you miscalculate if you believe observation alone will grant dominance. Every gesture, every minor disturbance is interpreted. And interpretation is the weapon of the disciplined mind. A moment of tension followed, thick and unyielding. The intruder's eyes flicked once more across the room, assessing, calculating, then stepping back slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of their mouth. We shall see, they said softly, and retreated, slipping almost invisibly into the shadows of the adjoining hallways. The room remained still after they vanished, the silence now charged with understanding. Wolfe leaned back, expression calm, almost indulgent. Observe the departure, he said. Even in retreat there is message, there is meaning, and those who are disciplined discern it. We spent the rest of the night reviewing movements, noting traces, cross-referencing behaviors, mapping the patterns of intrusion and response. The intruder had escalated from subtle disturbances to direct engagement, and it was clear they would continue to test, probe, and challenge. By the early hours of morning, exhaustion weighed heavily upon us. Yet even then, Wolfe's instructions remained clear. Observe, interpret, anticipate. The intruder's actions were no longer random. They were deliberate, intelligent, and increasingly audacious. And in that realization, the stakes became unmistakable. The game had evolved, the challenge had intensified, and the ultimate revelation of identity and motive loomed closer with each calculated move. The morning light barely penetrated the curtains, yet the brownstone carried the residue of the previous night's tension. Every surface, every shadow seemed charged with the memory of subtle disturbances, deliberate gestures, and calculated observation. Wolfe remained seated in his chair, hands folded across his chest, eyes tracing invisible patterns in the room. Saul had already begun his inspection of doors, windows, and the lesser-known exits. His movements quiet, methodical, unhurried. Lucia walked past, carrying a tray of tea. She paused just outside Wolfe's line of sight, her eyes scanning the room, noting details that might elude a less practiced observer. Peter lingered near the pantry, the tension in his shoulders still visible, his fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of a cabinet. Even Hargrove, usually so composed, showed signs of heightened awareness, a subtle straightening of posture, a tightening of jaw, a glance toward every shifting shadow. The intruder had not returned yet, but the impact of their presence lingered in the rhythm of our movements. Each of us had internalized a heightened state of vigilance, every step calculated, every gesture measured. Wolfe finally spoke, his voice soft but deliberate. Their pattern is deliberate. We are no longer merely reacting. We are being studied, interpreted, catalogued. Every pause, every glance, every restrained impulse is noted. And therein lies both our strength and vulnerability. I took a careful sip of tea, listening as Wolfe continued. The intruder is aware of human tendencies, the instinct to act, to confront, to assert dominance. But they are not reckless. Their precision is a demonstration, a challenge to our own understanding. We must respond with foresight, not force. Kerrigan, notebook open, began to record micro-patterns. The faint scent of smoke in the fireplace area, the displaced rugs, the minute scratches on the hardwood floor, the subtle alignment of furniture that seemed designed to manipulate movement. Every minor detail had significance. Wolfe had trained us to recognize that. By mid-morning, Saul had confirmed that no additional entries had been made overnight, yet the lingering traces of presence told a different story. The intruder had left no conventional evidence, no fingerprints, no forced locks, yet every element of the environment had been subtly altered. It was as though the space itself had been rewritten to convey a message, a silent dialogue with those capable of discerning it. Peter finally spoke, breaking the heavy quiet. "Do you think they'll come back? Or was last night the peak of their engagement?" His voice was tentative, hesitant, betraying both curiosity and fear. Wolfe's gaze fixed on him. "They will return. Every game has a rhythm, and the rhythm of this one requires escalation. What occurred last night was an audition, an assessment. Tonight they will increase pressure, and the test will evolve." Lucia added quietly, "They're testing more than observation. They're testing our reactions, how we respond to stress, to uncertainty, to each other. They want to see who remains disciplined, who falters under pressure." The day passed, slowly, punctuated by careful inspections and silent strategy discussions. Hargrove and Martin reviewed entry points, exit routes, and patterns of movement in the brownstone. Kerrigan cross-referenced minor details from the previous night, noting inconsistencies, subtle anomalies, and possible misdirections. Each of us contributed to the growing map of understanding, yet Wolfe remained the central point of cohesion, interpreting patterns that none of us could fully see. As evening approached, the atmosphere thickened. Shadows lengthened, and the brownstone seemed to shrink, each hallway and room more charged with anticipation than the last. Wolfe summoned us again, and the orchids, faintly fragrant, filled the room with a calm illusion that belied the intensity of what we were about to face. "Observe not only movement," Wolfe said, "but intention. The intruder communicates through subtle alteration. Every rearranged object, every shifted shadow is a message. It is both declaration and test, and it is our task to interpret without revealing our comprehension." A soft scraping sound echoed from the far hallway, almost imperceptible. Saul's head turned, ears attuned. "That came from the library," he whispered. We moved cautiously, Peter leading at Wolfe's signal, Lucia slightly behind him, ready to intervene if necessary, and Hargrove flanking from the rear. The library door was again ajar, the faint scent of smoke lingering, as though it had followed us from the previous night. The intruder's message was clear. They were still present, still in control, still testing the boundaries of our vigilance. Kerrigan knelt, examining the floor. "Footprints," she said softly. "Not fresh, but recent, small, deliberate, left to be noticed." Wolfe approached, his gaze sweeping the room. "Precisely. They want acknowledgement, but not confrontation. Observe, interpret, but do not act hastily. The patterns reveal character more than strength or skill. Their intention is to map ours, to force discernment of the disciplined from the impulsive." From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow detach from behind the fireplace. A faint rustle of fabric, a movement too subtle for immediate recognition. The intruder's presence was both physical and psychological, an invisible weight that demanded attention, that manipulated our awareness and tested our composure. Peter froze, poised to speak, yet Wolfe's slight gesture stopped him. There would be no reaction without understanding. Even hesitation could reveal vulnerability. Then the intruder stepped fully into view, hands raised slightly, posture measured, eyes assessing. "You continue to observe," they said, voice calm, deliberate, almost conversational. "Good. Observation is not passive. It is engagement, interpretation, and anticipation. And I am curious, who among you understands that distinction?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Understanding does not require your validation. Observation is not mere acknowledgement. It is comprehension. Comprehension dictates response, and response dictates outcome." The intruder's gaze swept over the room, noting Peter's tense posture, Lucia's poised readiness, Martin's internal conflict, Hargrove's subtle adjustments, and Kerrigan's meticulous recording. Each had displayed discipline, yes, but each had also revealed minor vulnerabilities, micro-gestures that signaled reaction, hesitation, or uncertainty. A faint smile played at the intruder's lips. "I see, very well. The game intensifies, and the next stage and requires interaction. Observation alone will not suffice. Without another word, the intruder withdrew, almost ghost-like, slipping back into the shadows of the hallway. The room fell silent, yet the tension remained thick and unyielding, charged with anticipation for what would come next. Wolfe leaned back, calm, yet commanding. They have escalated once more. Take note. Every engagement, direct or indirect, reveals strategy, character, and intent, and those who can maintain composure, who can interpret without reacting impulsively, will ultimately determine the outcome. We spent the remainder of the night reviewing movements, patterns, and the minor anomalies left behind. Each trace, each deliberate alteration, became a piece of the evolving puzzle. The intruder was intelligent, precise, and increasingly audacious, and it was clear that they would continue to escalate, testing both observation and restraint, challenging not only our awareness, but our judgment. By dawn, exhaustion had set in, yet the focus remained unbroken. Wolfe's instructions echoed in the quiet corners of the brownstone. Anticipate, interpret, discern. The intruder's methods were now unmistakable, deliberate, calculated, and psychologically probing. The stakes had shifted from simple intrusion to a complex contest of intellect and discipline. And in that awareness, we realized the game had reached a new dimension. Observation alone would no longer suffice. Understanding, anticipation, and precise response would determine who remained in control, who succumbed to instinct, and who ultimately revealed themselves through the subtle betrayals of reaction. The morning air carried a sharpness that seemed almost deliberate, as though it mirrored the intensity lingering inside the brownstone. Wolfe remained in his usual chair, immobile except for the subtle movements of his fingers, which tapped rhythmically against his knee. The orchids, ever silent witnesses, emitted their soft fragrance, filling the room with an odd tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the heightened vigilance of everyone present. Saul moved quietly from room to room, inspecting every potential point of entry. His steps were deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial, as if the act of inspection itself were a dance with the intruder, a silent acknowledgement of their presence. Each creak of the floorboard, each draft at a window, became a potential clue, a message left for those capable of discerning its meaning. Lucia, standing by the tea trolley, observed the patterns of behavior in the room. Her eyes tracked subtle gestures, the way Peter unconsciously shifted his weight when unsure, how Martin's hand lingered near a drawer handle, and the occasional flicker of Hargrove's eyes toward every corner where shadows gathered. Every micro-gesture was a language, and we had learned to read it fluently. Wolfe finally spoke, his voice calm but precise. "We are approaching a critical juncture. The intruder's methods have evolved beyond mere observation. They seek not only to test our patience and perception, but to elicit a response that reveals character and comprehension. Their goal is clarity through manipulation, understanding through provocation." Peter frowned, tension etched into the lines of his face. "Do you think they're expecting us to confront them? Or are they just testing?" Wolfe's gaze fixed upon him. "Confrontation is a tool, not an end. They are testing not merely for engagement, but for the subtle surrender of control, for the exposure of instinct over reason, and those who reveal themselves prematurely, through impulse or error, will provide the answers the intruder seeks." Kerrigan, crouched near a window, traced the edges of a faint mark on the sill. "They're leaving us breadcrumbs," she murmured. "Not overt, not accidental, but precise. Each one is a deliberate choice, a signal that they exist, not only physically but psychologically, embedding themselves into our awareness without direct confrontation." Hargrove adjusted, the angle of a chair almost imperceptibly, as though aligning the room for observation rather than comfort. "It's like they're playing chess with us," he said quietly, "but the pieces are our own reactions." The day moved forward with a tense rhythm, each hour carrying the weight of anticipation. Wolfe directed the team to map every anomaly, every pattern of intrusion, every subtle trace left behind. Each room was scrutinized with meticulous care. The slight displacement of a rug, a faint smudge on a doorframe, a subtle rearrangement of books on a shelf. These were not random acts. They were deliberate, designed to convey meaning to those patient and observant enough to interpret them. By late afternoon, the intruder had made a new mark, a set of papers carefully arranged on Wolfe's desk containing only a series of symbols, almost hieroglyphic in their ambiguity. Wolfe leaned over them, his eyes scanning each curve, each line, each subtle deviation. "Communication," he said softly. "They are speaking through pattern, expecting interpretation rather than immediate action." Peter, leaning close, whispered, "What does it mean? Is it a code?" Wolfe's lips pressed into a thin line. "It is not for speculation. Each symbol, each line, is a deliberate test of comprehension. They are assessing not only what we see, but how we see it, how we interpret, and what conclusions we draw. Errors in perception provide them with insight into our methods and limits." Lucia poured tea for everyone, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. "It feels like they're everywhere," she admitted softly. "But I know they're not. And yet—" She trailed off, the weight of unspoken anxiety filling the space between words. The intruder's next move arrived in the evening, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, originating from the farthest corner of the brownstone. It was deliberate, a subtle shift in floorboards, a soft, almost musical scrape against the wall. Saul's head tilted, ears trained, and he motioned for us to remain silent. Wolfe's voice, low and measured, broke the quiet. "Observe. Do not react. The moment we act without full comprehension, we relinquish control. They are inviting engagement, yet the engagement is a trap for the unwary. We advanced as a unit, each step measured, each movement calculated. Peter led cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows, Lucia close behind, Kerrigan documenting every micro-detail, Hargrove providing discreet support, and Saul prepared to intercept if necessary. Wolfe followed, observing, analyzing, orchestrating the movement of the team as if each of us were an instrument in a larger symphony. The sound led us to a hallway previously overlooked. The air felt thicker here, almost tactile with anticipation. On the floor a single playing card rested, a queen of spades face up. The choice was deliberate, symbolic, a silent communication. Wolfe crouched, inspecting the card. "They leave a signature," he said quietly. "Not random, not accidental. This is a message of intellect, of precision, and of challenge." Kerrigan leaned closer. "It's almost theatrical," she said, "but there's meaning in the placement. They want us to see it, interpret it, and respond correctly. Every error in judgment feeds their understanding of us." Wolfe's gaze swept the room. "Precisely. They are not merely intruding, they are orchestrating a demonstration of insight and comprehension. Each interaction, each trace, each calculated placement is a mirror reflecting our capacity for observation and discernment." As night settled, the tension in the brownstone became almost tangible. The intruder had escalated, their strategy now a layered test of intellect, patience, and restraint. The patterns were no longer subtle, they were challenges, each one demanding interpretation, each one measuring our ability to control instinct and act with deliberation. Peter finally broke the silence. Do we know who it is yet? Or are we still as guessing?" Wolfe's eyes, sharp and unyielding, fixed on him. "Guessing is for the untrained mind. We observe, we interpret, and we anticipate. They will reveal themselves only when we have demonstrated understanding, and understanding requires both patience and perception. Until then, all is conjecture and distraction." Lucia sighed quietly. "It's like they're inside our heads without actually being here. Every thought, every reaction feels anticipated. Anticipation is the currency of strategy," Wolfe replied. "They deal in it, we respond, but only those who maintain composure and clarity will dictate the outcome." The night deepened, and still no further direct confrontation occurred. Yet the presence of the intruder was undeniable. Each subtle sound, each rearranged object, each deliberate pattern contributed to a sense of calculated omnipresence. It was psychological warfare, a test of intellect and composure played out in silence and observation. As dawn approached, Wolfe finally directed us to review all the anomalies, all the traces, all the micro-gestures observed over the past days. Every detail was catalogued, interpreted and mapped, forming a network of comprehension that extended beyond the immediate. The intruder's intent was becoming clearer, their methods fully visible, not merely to intrude, but to assess, to measure, to manipulate and to challenge, and in that realization we understood the evolving nature of the contest. It was no longer about mere presence or intrusion, it was about perception, patience, and the discipline to observe without yielding to impulse. The intruder's identity remained hidden, yet the framework of their strategy was now unmistakable. The game had reached a level of sophistication that demanded intellect over instinct, subtlety over force, and patience over action. The Queen of Spades, resting silently on the floor, seemed to encapsulate the essence of the intruder's method. A challenge, a test, a deliberate sign that every movement, every decision, every interpretation mattered. And as Wolfe leaned back, hands folded, eyes scanning the familiar room, it became clear the confrontation was inevitable, but only on terms defined by understanding, not by force. We had observed, interpreted, and catalogued. The intruder had tested, probed, and challenged, and as the first light of day filtered through the curtains, it was evident that the final revelation, the ultimate engagement, would come only when comprehension and patience converged perfectly. Until then, we existed in a tense equilibrium, each aware of the other, each measured, each deliberate, and each preparing for the inevitable moment when intellect would clash with cunning. The morning light was pale, almost hesitant, filtering through the tall windows of the brownstone in streaks that seemed to measure the hours with precision. Wolfe remained in his chair, his posture unchanged, but his eyes had a new intensity, alert, calculating, and waiting. Every surface in the room seemed to hum with the silent anticipation that had grown over days, a quiet electricity that suggested the balance of power was about to shift. Saul moved with measured precision, checking doors, windows, and corners, his presence almost ceremonial. Each step was deliberate, echoing softly across the hardwood floors. A sound meant not only to inspect, but to assert readiness. Peter and Kerrigan mirrored this attentiveness, their eyes scanning the room, tracking shadows, and noting subtle displacements in furniture or objects. Even the orchids seemed to lean slightly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Wolfe spoke at last, his voice low but unyielding. The intruder has shifted tactics. We are no longer being tested solely by observation or subtle manipulation. Their approach is now overt, though still measured. They seek confrontation, but in a form that forces intellect above instinct. This is a challenge, not a threat. Lucia poured tea with steady hands, her gaze fixed on the patterns of light. Across the room. "It feels like they're inside the house with us," she murmured. "But every move, every sound is calculated. They want us to act on assumption." "Exactly," Wolfe replied. "And those who act on assumption without evidence will provide the answers the intruder seeks. Patience, precision, and comprehension are now our only defenses." The first sign of escalation arrived as a soft scrape, deliberate and unmistakable, emanating from the hallway leading to the study. Saul's head tilted, ears trained. "They're here," he whispered. "They want to be noticed without being seen." Wolfe rose slowly, a motion that drew the eyes of all present. "Do not engage recklessly. Observe, interpret, and respond. Only when clarity is absolute. The intruder thrives on reaction. Patience is our instrument." We advanced as a coordinated unit, every movement deliberate. Peter led cautiously, his gaze sweeping every corner. Kerrigan followed with a notebook, documenting micro-gestures, minute anomalies, and potential entry points. Hargrove shadowed the group, ready to intervene if necessary, while Lucia stayed close to Wolfe, her senses attuned to every sound and shift. Saul's presence was a silent anchor, a measure of readiness that permeated the team. At the entrance to the study, a single object rested on the desk, a small, intricately carved wooden box. Its placement was deliberate, central, and impossible to ignore. Wolfe crouched, inspecting the craftsmanship with meticulous care. "A signature," he said softly. "The intruder leaves marks not only for attention, but for interpretation." "This is both a challenge and a test." Peter leaned closer. Should we open it? Wolfe's gaze was steady, measured. Not yet. Observation precedes action. The box itself, its placement, its design, all communicate intention. To act without comprehension would be to surrender control. We waited, collectively silent as Wolfe studied the box. Every curve, every notch, every shadow created by the light seemed to speak to him, revealing an intricate puzzle embedded in physical form. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, its edges worn, its surface marked with symbols that mirrored those left on his desk days earlier. They speak in pattern and repetition, Wolfe said, voice calm but sharp. They seek understanding, not confrontation in the conventional sense. Each symbol, each line, is a deliberate measure of our perception and patience. Kerrigan leaned in, studying the symbols. It's a code, she said, but it's more than letters or numbers. It's psychological. They want us to interpret, to feel the structure, to understand intention. Wolfe nodded. Precisely. The intruder operates not only in space, but in cognition. Each choice is layered, each placement deliberate. They measure intellect, patience, hand composure. They are invisible yet omnipresent through strategy and design. The air shifted again, a subtle pressure that was almost tactile. A new sound emerged, soft but precise. A footstep that was not ours, a whisper of movement in a distant corridor. Saul's body tensed, ready, while Wolfe's eyes flicked toward the source without turning his head. They approach indirectly, Wolfe said. We are now being drawn into engagement, but engagement on their terms. Observe, interpret, and only respond with certainty. Peter swallowed, his hands gripping the edge of a chair. How long before they reveal themselves? Or do they even plan to? They reveal themselves only when they have measured our understanding, Wolfe replied. Until then, every trace, every gesture, every pattern is a signal, a probe, a test. The moment we misinterpret, we provide insight into our methods and limits. The day moved forward with tension thickening the air. The intruder's presence became a constant shadow, felt in the slight misalignment of furniture, the subtle marks on walls and the carefully arranged objects that seemed to communicate in an unspoken language. Each anomaly was deliberate, a silent message demanding observation and comprehension. By evening, Wolfe directed us to consolidate all observed patterns, tracing the intruder's methods, mapping their strategy, and cataloguing every micro-gesture. The wooden box, now fully studied, revealed layers of intentional design, compartments within compartments, symbols that interacted, and spaces meant to test observation and deduction. The intruder had created a mental labyrinth within physical form, a testament to intellect and patience. Lucia's voice broke the quiet. It's like they're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Every thought, every reaction feels anticipated. Anticipation is their instrument, Wolfe replied. They orchestrate, we interpret. The outcome hinges not on force but on comprehension, not on impulse but on deliberation. A faint click echoed from the far end of the hallway, precise, deliberate. It was a key turning in a lock, a movement designed to attract attention without threat. Saul's posture stiffened. Peter and Kerrigan instinctively moved closer. Wolfe remained calm, observing the rhythm and cadence of the sound. They are initiating the final phase, Wolfe said quietly. Engagement is imminent, but the terms are defined by intellect, observation, and patience. We respond only when the strategy is fully understood. The intruder entered the study, finally visible yet measured in their approach. A figure, composed and deliberate, moved with the precision of someone accustomed to observation and calculation. Wolfe's gaze remained fixed, evaluating, interpreting, assessing character and intent. The figure spoke, their voice calm, controlled. You've observed, interpreted, and catalogued. I have tested your patience, your perception, and your comprehension. The question now is whether your understanding is complete, whether you can act without yielding to impulse. Wolfe inclined his head, expression unreadable. You have presented your challenge with clarity and precision. Observation has been thorough, interpretation deliberate. Now we assess your intent. A silence followed, thick and charged, each of us aware of the delicate balance. The intruder's presence was no longer abstract. It was tangible, an intellectual force that tested every measure of our awareness. You seek understanding through engagement, the intruder said, and yet the greatest comprehension comes not from direct confrontation, but from patience, from subtle interpretation, from the discipline to act only when clarity is absolute. Wolfe's reply was calm, deliberate. Precisely, and those who act without observation, who yield to impulse, provide insight not only into themselves, but into the nature of strategy and intellect. The room seemed to contract around us. Every object, every shadow, every sound a part of the unspoken dialogue between intellects. The confrontation had begun, but it was not one of force or aggression. It was a contest of comprehension, patience, and measured response. As night fell completely, the intruder's presence remained, a reminder that intellect and strategy had created a new equilibrium. Observation and patience were no longer passive. They were active instruments, shaping the path of engagement and defining the terms of confrontation. The chessboard was set, the pieces in position, and the players poised for the decisive moves. Wolfe leaned back, eyes never leaving the intruder. Hands folded, mind calculating every possibility. The ultimate engagement was at hand, not through violence but through intellect, not through impulse but through deliberate understanding. And in that knowledge the brownstone held its silent vigil, a theater of strategy, perception, and unyielding patience. Wolfe sat in his chair as if the brownstone itself had conspired to hold its breath. The orchids on the terrace seemed to straighten, the afternoon sunlight glinting off their petals like attentive witnesses. I leaned against the archway, the crate of peppers from Calhoun still by my side, wondering how the next few hours were going to unfold. There was no need for me to ask Wolfe what he was thinking. His calm presence telegraphed that he had a plan far beyond my pedestrian observation. He finally spoke, his voice low and precise. "Archie, summon Saul Panzer and Fred Durkin. I want eyes on the premises tonight, and I want no surprises. Peter Calhoun's gala will proceed, and we will be present, not as patrons, but as quiet observers of human frailty." I called Saul, who agreed without the usual interrogation of details, the sort of thing professionals with experience in Wolfe's world do. Durkin was less subtle, muttering about how people who tamper with food should have their hands, carefully, removed. Wolfe ignored both comments. By late afternoon, the brownstone hummed with barely contained anticipation. The usual calm had been replaced by a taut, almost palpable tension. Wolfe had not moved from his chair, except to occasionally flip a page or sip a cup of coffee that never cooled enough to be enjoyable. The suspects were being quietly watched, and I could see how nervous it made some of them, particularly the kitchen staff Calhoun had sent over to discuss the final preparations. Each had a quirk, a gesture, or a glance that could betray them, though Wolfe required no one to betray themselves in front of him. He preferred to orchestrate revelations with words and timing, letting human nature expose itself like petals under a heat lamp. By 5, Calhoun arrived at the brownstone himself, pacing as if the crates of carefully prepared dishes were live grenades. Wolfe did not rise to greet him, nor did he offer the faintest encouragement. "Mr. Calhoun," Wolfe said, "I assume you have maintained the integrity of the kitchen staff and ingredients. I have no interest in culinary heroics, merely in human honesty." Calhoun swallowed hard, looking as though Wolfe had just carved the words out of a slab of marble and hurled them at him. "Yes, Mr. Wolfe," he stammered. "We've been careful. Everything is as planned. But I don't know who would do this, or why. It's like someone wants me to fail." "Motives are seldom invisible," Wolfe replied, calm as ever, "and humans are rarely as careful as they believe themselves to be." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before addressing me. "Archie, prepare to accompany Peter Calhoun to the gala. Observe, report, and most importantly remember that the smallest detail can expose the largest deceit." I packed my notebook, slipped the crate into the car, and tried to match my skepticism with a hint of curiosity. Gala dinners rarely end with revelations. They usually end with indigestion or awkward small talk. But Wolfe had chosen this event for its potential, the intersection of opportunity, human weakness and misapplied ambition, and I knew better than to underestimate the man. As we arrived at the venue, a swank midtown hall with polished marble and sparkling chandeliers, I realized that the audience itself was part of the stage. Guests milled about, laughing and sipping cocktails, oblivious to the potential disaster lurking in their plates. Chefs and assistants scurried behind service, doors placing dishes with meticulous precision. The red peppers, one crate, sat under a glass dome, innocuous and serene, belying the chaos they might induce. I stationed myself at a vantage point where I could observe both the kitchen and the main room. It didn't take long for subtle anomalies to appear. A sous chef, hands slightly trembling, adjusted a tray of hors d'oeuvres more often than necessary. Another staff member kept glancing toward the pepper crate, a nervous flicker of recognition crossing his features. Meanwhile, Calhoun moved about, projecting calm that clearly did not exist, and I scribbled notes furiously. Each small gesture, each glance would feed Wolfe's eventual conclusion. Minutes stretched into an hour, and I began to see patterns that confirmed Wolfe's quiet suspicion. Someone among the staff was anxious in a way that went beyond mere stage fright. Their eyes flickered to the crate with the kind of curiosity that is impossible to suppress completely. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Wolfe would notice. He always did. Finally, as the guests began sampling the first courses, a small commotion erupted in the kitchen. A dish was missing a garnish, one that had been replaced by something suspiciously similar, but slightly off in color and texture. I rushed to inform Wolfe, expecting irritation, perhaps even a small eruption of vocal dissatisfaction. Instead, he leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing. "Very good, Archie," he said. "You see how easily deception finds a stage, even in the most meticulously organized performance. Continue watching. Every action has a consequence, and every reaction exposes intent." I noted the replacement ingredient, checked the staff reactions, and realized that the tension was now building toward the inevitable confrontation. Wolfe was orchestrating it silently, like a composer whose symphony unfolded without a single misstep. Each glance, each gesture, each small error from the staff was another note in his arrangement, and I felt the thrill of being part of a mental choreography far beyond my usual beatings on the streets. Then, as the main course was being served, it happened. One of the assistant chefs, a man I had already marked as suspicious, tripped near the tray holding the red peppers. Nothing fell, nothing broke, but the smallest sprinkle of pepper dust caught the edge of a napkin and floated gently onto a serving platter. A guest, unsuspecting, lifted the fork and paused, blinking rapidly. The heat was immediate. She coughed softly, reached for water, and glanced around with a faint panic. Other guests nearby reacted similarly, confusion rippling across the dining room. I rushed to the scene, assessing the reaction, while Wolfe remained seated in my mind's eye, detached but fully aware. This was exactly the catalyst he had anticipated. The moment when human frailty, fear, and deception would intersect. And as I noted the chef's guilty flinch, I realized that Wolfe's web had tightened invisibly, but decisively. After a few more minutes of observation, I returned to the brownstone. With Calhoun reports in hand, my notebook crammed with small inconsistencies and behavioral tics, Wolfe was waiting, perfectly composed, as if the entire spectacle had been nothing more than an afternoon diversion. He took the notes from me, glanced through them with his usual precision, and nodded slightly. "Good. Everything you observed confirms what I suspected. Prepare for the final phase, Archie. Soon all shadows will fall into the light." I realized then that the mystery had reached the edge of revelation, that the clues, the human reactions, and the carefully orchestrated pressures were ready to snap into clarity. Wolfe, in his chair, calm and immovable, was ready to expose the truth without lifting a finger. And I, with pen and eyes and ears, would witness the moment when deception met intellect, and the invisible hand of justice would write the final act. The night was far from over, but the stage was set. The suspects, the misplaced ingredients, the subtle sabotage, all were in position. Wolfe had ensured that when the moment came, human nature would betray itself, and the mastermind would reveal their own hand. I sipped my coffee, thinking that sometimes the quietest detective could be the most terrifying force in the room, and Wolfe, as always, was about to prove it. The following morning, the brownstone felt unusually quiet. Even the orchids seemed to hold their breath, as if aware that the hour of revelation had arrived. Wolfe had remained in his chair through the night, only rising briefly to inspect the notes I had compiled during the gala. His movements were deliberate, each step a measured assertion of control over the chaos that had unfolded. He gestured toward me. "Archie, gather Calhoun, the kitchen staff, and the assistants. All will be present in the drawing room. It is time to see how deception fares when confronted with observation, deduction, and consequence." I followed instructions, feeling a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. None of us truly knew how Wolfe intended to reveal the culprit, but the air itself seemed charged with expectation. As they assembled, the room was tight with tension. Calhoun stood near the window, hands clasped, eyes darting with unease. The kitchen staff shifted nervously, their postures betraying the smallest hints of guilt. Some avoided eye contact entirely, while others fidgeted with aprons and utensils. Wolfe remained seated, almost regal, as if the world itself had conspired to place him in the perfect vantage point to witness human frailty. He began calmly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "It is remarkable how easily a carefully laid plan can be disrupted by minor miscalculations, by the subtle tremor of fear, or by the faintest trace of greed. The events of last evening were neither accidental nor unpredictable. Every detail, every reaction, and every misstep has been observed, and now it is time to confront the truth." He paused, letting the words sink in. The staff shifted uncomfortably, glances exchanged with suspicion and unease. I could see the tension coiling, preparing for release. Wolfe continued, each phrase deliberate, precise. "There is among you an individual who sought to compromise the integrity of Mr. Calhoun's gala, substituting the expected with an ingredient designed to provoke discomfort, if not more severe consequences. That individual relied upon subtlety, trust, and the assumption that human observation could be circumvented. But observation, as you have seen, can be relentless." Eyes flickered, hands twitched. The room seemed to constrict with anticipation. Wolfe's gaze swept over each person, not accusing but revealing, like a scalpel separating truth from pretense. "One among you believed their actions would remain unnoticed, and yet their every move has left a trail, invisible to the casual observer but impossible to escape when scrutiny is methodical, patient, and unrelenting." He leaned forward slightly, hands steepled, and fixed a gaze on the assistant chef I had already marked at the gala. The man's posture stiffened. His breathing became uneven. Sweat glistened at the base of his neck. "It is unnecessary to deny your actions. Every glance, every hesitation, every moment of misdirection has already spoken louder than any defense you could offer. Do you understand, Mr. Langley?" Langley's voice faltered. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Do not feign ignorance. The misplacement of ingredients, the subtle misalignment of garnishes, the anxious handling of the peppers, all of this was unnecessary unless motivated by intent. Intent is not invisible. Intent reveals itself in pattern, in behavior, in the smallest deviation from expected human conduct, and your pattern has been noted, catalogued, and verified." Langley's hands trembled as he fumbled with his apron, his face pale. I didn't think anyone would notice." Archie, standing beside me, exhaled quietly. It was one thing to anticipate the exposure, another to witness it unfold in real time. Wolfe did not speak again immediately. He allowed the silence to press upon Langley, to make him inhabit the weight of discovery fully. Then he resumed. "Mr. Langley, the question is not why I have discovered your actions, but why you undertook them at all. Was it ambition, a sense of grievance, or simply the thrill of manipulation?" Langley's voice broke, barely audible. I thought if I substituted the peppers, it would make me look more capable. Everyone was watching, and I wanted to prove I could manage things on my own. I didn't mean anyone harm, just recognition." Wolfe's expression softened almost imperceptibly, but there was no compromise in his tone. Recognition obtained through deceit is neither stable nor honorable. It breeds consequences, as you have learned. Observation, careful scrutiny, and human nature conspire to reveal every hidden act. You have learned this lesson, perhaps painfully, but it is a lesson that must be remembered. He turned slightly, directing his attention to Calhoun. Mr. Calhoun, your gala was nearly compromised, not through negligence on your part, but through the impatience and poor judgment of one individual among your staff. Your foresight, coupled with proper oversight, has ensured that disaster was averted. But the lesson remains. Human error and ambition often intersect in the most unexpected ways. Calhoun exhaled, relief evident in his shoulders, but tempered by a lingering sense of betrayal. Langley's shame was absolute, and the others were left to consider the implications of their complicity by association. Wolfe stood slowly, every movement deliberate, commanding the room without theatrics. Let this be a demonstration of what careful observation and reasoned deduction can achieve. Chaos and deception, no matter how subtle, cannot withstand the weight of sustained scrutiny. Let this also be a reminder that integrity is not merely about adherence to rules, but the recognition that human behavior is most revealing when placed under pressure. Justice, even in small domestic matters, requires patience, attention, and intellect. Langley nodded miserably, and Wolfe turned back to me. Archie, ensure that Mr. Calhoun's staff understands the importance of oversight, the necessity of meticulous honesty, and the consequences of misjudged ambition. Let this be an education, not merely a rebuke. I delivered Wolfe's instructions with care, feeling the weight of his words resonate throughout the room. It was more than a correction, it was an embodiment of his philosophy. Each person present would remember this moment long after the flavors of the gala had faded. By mid-afternoon, the tension had eased. Langley had apologized properly, his genuine contrition acknowledged. Calhoun was reassured, the gala's success restored to narrative coherence. Wolfe returned to his chair, resuming the quiet dominion of the brownstone, as if the events of the day had been nothing more than a routine observation. I sat across from him, reflecting on the intricacy of his method. He had not shouted, berated, or coerced. He had simply allowed human nature to reveal itself, carefully guiding the circumstances until the truth emerged organically. It was, as always, a lesson in the power of intellect over impulse, observation over assumption, and patience over hasty action. As I closed my notebook, Wolfe's gaze met mine. Justice, when carefully applied, does not require dramatics, Archie. The human mind, if observed without prejudice, will supply its own confessions. It is our task to see, understand, and act when the moment is ripe. I nodded, appreciating the finality of the day's lesson. The mystery had been resolved, not with spectacle but with precision. Langley's ambition, misguided though it was, had been exposed, corrected, and ultimately contained. Calhoun's gala had proceeded without further incident, a testament to careful preparation and the quiet power of methodical oversight. And Wolfe, ever the sentinel in his chair, remained the calm center of a world perpetually in motion, proof that intellect, patience, and observation could tame even the subtlest chaos. The case was closed. The truth had been revealed. And as I left the brownstone that evening, notebook tucked under my arm, I realized once more that in Wolfe's universe, resolution was not merely about uncovering deceit, but about understanding the fragile patterns of human behavior that give rise to it. Wolfe had called everyone back into the office, and for the first time there was a palpable tension in the brownstone that even the orchids seemed to notice. Each suspect fidgeted, eyeing the crates of untouched peppers and the neat stacks of culinary notes Wolfe had laid out with surgical precision. Peter Calhoun sat closest to the desk, nervously twisting his hands together, while the others, chefs, assistants, and a few enigmatic food critics, hovered near the periphery, each masking something behind polite expressions. I could feel the air thickening with anticipation, and I wasn't even directly involved in the academic nature of the case. My role, as usual, was to observe, note, and occasionally offer a quip that would be swallowed by Wolfe's silence. But Wolfe was far from silent now. He leaned forward slightly, his massive head framed by the soft morning light streaming through the high windows, and spoke in that slow, precise tone that made even seasoned manipulators pause. "Gentlemen," he began, voice calm, almost gentle. "And gentlewoman," he added with a glance at the only female assistant present. "It seems we are all assembled to discuss matters of taste, trust, and the unfortunate misuse of red peppers." He allowed a fraction of a second for that to sink in, watching carefully as eyebrows rose, shoulders stiffened, and one critic adjusted his glasses as though he were suddenly aware he might be in a different kind of spotlight. "Someone," Wolfe continued, "decided to compromise Mr. Calhoun's menu, intending to create a spectacle at a gala, to humiliate, to harm reputations. That someone believed that chaos could be mistaken for a culinary accident. The question is who?" I could almost hear the mental gears turning across the room. People shifted in their seats. It's one thing to deny wrongdoing in whispers, another entirely to do so under Wolfe's gaze. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need theatrics. His eyes alone demanded truth. Wolfe began his methodical reconstruction, stating the timeline of pepper deliveries, tastings, and kitchen rotations. He reminded everyone of minor inconsistencies, a misplaced spice jar, a slightly altered recipe. Note, a dish found prepared on the wrong shelf. I took notes mentally, already seeing how the pieces fit, but Wolfe wasn't just recounting facts. He was leading each suspect to a point where their own stories would betray them. Then he paused. That pause is where the magic happens. You could hear a pin drop in the high-ceilinged office. Wolfe's eyes flicked to a young assistant who had been unusually quiet, nervously straightening her apron. He leaned back, fingers steepled, and in that moment, you could see the gears turning even in a man whose belly never moved. "Miss Loring," Wolfe said softly, "you were the only one with both access to the peppers and knowledge of the gala's menu adjustments. You argued competence, yet failed to monitor the spice jars. You claimed loyalty, yet, by your own accounts, you handled these ingredients in secrecy from all but yourself. Tell me, what were you hoping to achieve?" Her face went pale. She faltered, words catching in her throat. I didn't think it would," she began, voice trembling. "I just wanted to show that I could control the kitchen better than anyone expected." Wolfe's gaze didn't waver. "Control, yes, but at what cost? You risked humiliation for the chef, fear for the guests, and disgrace for yourself, all for the sake of proving a point. That is the danger of ambition untethered by ethics." I had to suppress a laugh. Classic Wolfe. Never a shout, never a dramatics, but one calm observation that reduced someone's grand scheme to a trembling confession. She admitted everything: the swapped peppers, the hidden stash, even the slightly altered tasting notes meant to mislead the staff. Justice is not always punishment, Wolfe said, returning the confession to a broader philosophical plane. It is often clarity, exposure, and the restoration of order. He nodded once, satisfied. "Miss Loring, Mr. Calhoun, you will take steps to rectify this incident. Guests will be safe and reputations preserved. That is sufficient for now." I leaned back in my chair, scribbling quick notes. The tension in the room had evaporated like steam from a hot pan. Peter's relief was palpable. Even the critics who had been on edge were now adjusting their postures, realizing that the mystery had been solved without scandal or melodrama. Wolfe finally allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. He returned to the orchids, inspecting them with meticulous care, as if nothing had happened. I, of course, was left with the usual mix of admiration and exhaustion. "Archie," he said quietly, looking over his spectacles, "fetch the dinner. Let us eat, and let us reflect. There is a satisfaction in knowing the mind prevails where force would fail." I nodded. "And here I thought the peppers were the dangerous ones," I muttered. He didn't reply, which meant the lecture was over. The case was concluded, the mastermind exposed, and the brownstone had returned to its sacred stillness. The brownstone had settled into its usual calm, the quiet so complete it almost hummed. Outside, the city continued its relentless pulse, but inside everything was as it should be. The orchids arranged with exacting care, the leather chairs perfectly aligned, and the faint scent of dinner wafting from the kitchen. The disruption had passed. the mystery resolved, and yet there was that lingering satisfaction, the kind that comes from witnessing order restored without chaos. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and took a seat across from Wolfe. He was already at the head of the table, eyes on a plate of carefully prepared veal, barely acknowledging my presence. But I knew better. He never missed anything. Every glance, every gesture, every silence was a part of his observation, cataloguing and evaluating the world from the vantage of his immovable chair. "The case is closed," he said finally, voice calm, deliberate. "Miss Loring understands the consequences of her ambition. Mr. Calhoun's menu remains intact. The gala will proceed without embarrassment or scandal. The integrity of the kitchen and the reputation of those who inhabit it is preserved." He paused, eyes drifting to the orchids. "And all because we relied on the mind rather than haste, reflection rather than reaction." I shook my head with a small, wry smile. "You make it sound almost poetic, Wolfe. A pepper, a little deception, and a couple of nerves. Yet somehow you make it feel like a symphony." He didn't respond, merely lifting his fork in a precise, measured motion, cutting a piece of veal as though the act itself were part of some larger logic puzzle. But I could read the faint trace of approval in his eyes, a recognition that the order had been restored and that his methods, as always, had prevailed. As we ate in companionable silence, the city's noise muted by the thick walls, I reflected on the events. There was a satisfaction in knowing the mind could solve what impulse could only complicate. There was a lesson, too. Ambition without foresight, cleverness without conscience, could lead only to exposure and correction, sometimes public, sometimes private, but always inevitable when faced with unyielding logic. Wolfe finished his plate and leaned back, folding his enormous hands over his stomach. "The essential principle, Archie, is that clarity is preferable to confusion and intellect preferable to force. One pepper, one slight miscalculation, and the entire structure of a plan can collapse. This is a lesson in restraint and awareness. Remember it." I couldn't resist. "I'll remember it, boss. But just in case, maybe we should keep the spice. Rack under lock and key next time." He allowed the smallest twitch of a smile. "An entirely practical solution, and one that appeals to reason. You may prepare dessert." I laughed quietly and rose, moving toward the kitchen with a sense of ease. The brownstone had regained its sacred rhythm, the crisis diffused, the lesson learned. Outside, the world could roar, but inside, intellect had triumphed over impulse, logic over chaos. And as always, Nero Wolfe sat at the center of it all, immovable, precise, victorious without ever raising his voice. And me? I made a mental note to enjoy my dessert before he decided it required re-evaluation. That at least was one victory I could claim. The city would continue its frenzy, people would continue their ambitions, and mistakes would continue to be made. But here, in this sanctuary of reason, we had witnessed the quiet power of thought, observation, and the unyielding pursuit of clarity. And that was enough. With this, Nero Wolfe and the pepper that made someone sweat reaches its conclusion. The mystery is resolved, the culprit exposed, the brownstone restored, and Wolfe leaves us with a philosophical reflection on intellect, restraint, and moral consequence. Archie's characteristic humor punctuates the ending, maintaining the tone of his first-person narration,